and welcome to this edition of Border Report Live. My name is Rudy Mireles, and I am your host here in Harlingen, Texas, in the Rio Grande Valley of deep South Texas. Got an incredible show lined up for you today. We're going to be speaking with Mr. Don Bell, Policy Counsel for the Constitution Project at the Project on Government. They're a nonpartisan, independent watchdog, so we're looking forward to that conversation on artificial intelligence when it comes to immigration. Our Sandra Sanchez is going to be leading that discussion. But first, before we get to him, we wanted to run through some of the things making headlines across the border, starting with the Federal Reserve, actually. So the Federal Reserve, you may or may not know, yesterday announced a highly anticipated interest rate cut, which is a move that indicated concerns about a slowing labor market now outweigh ongoing worries about inflation. But what role does his decision have to do with the border or immigration, you may be asking? Well, Powell said that the labor market is currently in an unusual state. He said the available supply of workers is also declining because of Trump's immigration crackdown. Take a listen to what he had to say after yesterday's FOMC meeting came to a close.
I would say if you're looking at why employment is doing what it's doing, that's much more about the change in immigration. So the supply of workers has obviously come way down. There's very little growth, if any, in the supply of workers. And at the same time, demand for workers has also come down quite sharply. And to the point where we see what I've called a curious balance. It's, typically when we say things are in balance, that sounds good. But in this case, the balance is because both supply and demand have come down quite sharply. Now demand coming down a little more sharply because we now see the unemployment rate edging up. I would say if you're looking at why employment is doing what it's doing, that's much more about the change.
Now, the flow of migrant workers into the United States has dropped significantly since the beginning of this year. Reuters is reporting that the pace was already slowing sharply before the election, but has ground to a near halt along with the rise in deportations this year, which we have been covering right here on Border Report Live, everywhere from here in the Rio Grande Valley all the way to San Diego, the San Diego sector where Salvador Rivera is. We've shown you all these different places who have been losing workers, and they're looking for workers. Some of these places even closing down over the past couple months. And we'll continue to stay on top of that as these jobs numbers continue to decrease over the coming months. Also happening, a judge is blocking the Trump administration from immediately deporting Guatemalan migrant children who came to the U.S. alone back to their home country. Now, this ruling comes after the Republican administration's Labor Day weekend attempt to remove Guatemalan migrant children from a South Texas airport right here in Harlingen, Texas, actually, who were living in government shelters and foster care. This is video our Sandra Sanchez actually shot of these flights. Video from our station here that was shot on these flights. They argue that many of these children were fleeing abuse or violence and that the government was bypassing longstanding legal procedures meant to protect them. The judge's decision extends a temporary order while the case plays out. And speaking of Sandra Sanchez, let's go ahead and bring in our South Texas correspondent now to expand on this reporting. Hey, Sandra.
Hey, Rudy, I wish I took that. No, our great cameraman here at KVEO took that video. It's interesting. We have been talking about these attempted deportation of the Guatemalan children. This was an injunction. It was temporary. It was set to expire, but the judge in D.C. has made it now permanent until these cases go through. And just to reiterate, because I know we've talked about this case a lot, it was Labor Day weekend. Hundreds of children were roused from their beds and told, pack your things. You are getting on flights and you were going back home to Guatemala. We've spoken to a number of NGOs who have said that the children didn't know what was happening. Some of them had the presence of mind to call their lawyers, and at least 74 children were put on two of these flights here. One of them took off and circled, came back, and now the judge is saying that the children who do not have removal orders cannot be removed. The Trump administration, however, is saying they're sticking to what they have said, that these children want to be repatriated. The families want them repatriated in Guatemala. However, several groups have said they went down there. They've said that a majority of these children are indigenous. They don't even speak Spanish. They don't know where these families are. The families haven't asked for their reunification. But I do, to represent the Trump administration side of it, Tricia McLaughlin, Homeland Security Assistant Secretary, in a statement told the Associated Press, quote, "This judge is blocking efforts to reunify children with their families. Now these children will have to go to shelters." As I mentioned, nonprofit groups are saying that these children have nowhere to go, that they, especially, we're talking Guatemalan children here, but there are also lawsuits involving Honduran children. And the Honduran children, they're saying that Honduras does not have the structure set up in that country to receive them back. There is one shelter there with 15 beds. They can maybe squeeze 5 more children in. We're talking 400 potential Guatemalan children Honduran children sent back. So the math doesn't add up, and I think a judge kind of realized that today.
And something we've talked about in the past, and you brought it up just now a few moments ago, was the fact that these children a lot of times are coming from these rural areas in these countries, and English nor Spanish are always the language that they're speaking there. So for people to be contacting these families allegedly, it kind of makes the story not seem like it's all really coming together correctly.
There are over 22 Mayan dialects, and some of these children don't even speak that. They're from even other cultures that we don't even know. And so, there's a lot of pieces that need to get in place, and I think that the judge just wants to take a beat and make sure that these children all have safe places to go to, and the nonprofits assure that they will continue to represent them while they're in this country.
And just really quick, one more question. I know that oftentimes when a migrant child is being held in some kind of detention facility, they no longer fall under ICE or DHS. They actually slide under to the purview of Health and Human Services. Is this the same case? So we don't really know what's going to happen with these children in the time between now and when the final decision is made?
Right. It's the Office of Refugee Resettlement, under part of the Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, not Department of Homeland Security. And so, no, we cannot track them. What's interesting, I listened to a press conference today. We're going to talk about that in a minute. And they were saying that, even immigrants who are under DHS are now falling in what they're calling a black box, where they're not having access to them. We as journalists do not have access to children under HHS custody. And now it looks like that's kind of extending to those under DHS as well.
Now, really quick before we head over to the break and then come back to Mr. Don Bell, Policy Counsel for the Constitution Project, I did want to ask you about a family, an update on a family that was recently deported that you've been kind of following their story.
Yeah, that was the press conference held today in Washington, D.C., but it involves a family here from the Rio Grande Valley. The parents are undocumented, and they have 5 children. They were crossing through, this is video I did shoot at the Sarita checkpoint, which is on the eastern counties here in our Gulf. And the parents have a child who had a brain tumor. She is 11. They're using pseudonyms. They're calling them Maria and Juan. Their last name is Hernandez. And the daughter they're calling Sarah. She's 11. She was crossing to go to receive medical care in Houston. The parents presented the paperwork. They've done this for years since she's had surgeries after surgeries. But Department of Homeland Security said, no, you're not here legally. You can deport with your children or alone. And so the parents chose to go with the 5 children that they had in their vehicle with them. One 17-year-old son actually was visiting friends and family, and he wasn't with them, and so he is still in this country. Now, the children are U.S. citizens, but they were sent back, and we heard some startling information about what happened to them when they were sent to Reynosa, to a migrant shelter. A woman who runs the shelter ran outside to receive them, told them to be quiet, don't say anything, get inside, and your children will not leave the doors. They were inside for 6 days. Reason being, she says, this is what the lawyer says, that the Mexican cartel target anyone that they can kidnap and hold for ransom. And certainly a U.S. citizen falls under that category. So the children were held up for 6 days in this shelter. And they finally were able to move the family to Monterrey, which is about 100 miles away. But they have appealed to DHS for an emergency asylum under humanitarian parole because of extenuating circumstances. They're trying to bring the 2 parents and the girl back because they're saying she's not receiving medical care in Mexico. She's not even enrolled in school. She can basically audit the classes, but when the grade moves up, she won't be able to move up. But they said her health condition is greatly deteriorating. She had a seizure last week. The good news is lawyer Danny Woodward from the Texas Civil Rights Project said yesterday officials with USCIS, Citizenship Immigration Services, they're the ones that issue the visas and the waivers, told him that they are looking at the case. So we'll keep up on that.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Sandra. Stick around because we're going to be leading that conversation with Mr. Don Bell of the Policy Council for the Constitution Project when we return and continue this discussion, or rather start a new discussion on the role of artificial intelligence on the future of immigration policy. Stay with us. Border Report Live is back in 1 minute. And welcome back to Border Report Live. My name is Rudy Mireles, and I'm your host here in Harlingen, Texas. Joining me today, our South Texas correspondent, Sandra Sanchez, and our very special guest for today's episode is Mr. Don Bell, Policy Counsel for the Constitution Project. Thank you so much for joining us today, Mr. Bell.
Thank you for having me.
Let me kick this off. Last week we had a discussion about AI surveillance. Mr. Bell, you are the Policy Council Constitution Project at the Project on Government. So a watchdog organization, keeping an eye on what the government does. And, recently Rudy and I talked about this $9 million contract issued to an organization, Clearview AI, for the agency to develop some software that will allow images from social media, from public websites to be scrubbed and to be used in AI surveillance in cases of law enforcement assaults and also child sexual exploitation, which could be child trafficking down here. I read a recent article you wrote on your website, and it says that the Trump immigration policies, quote, will require authoritarian tactics like all-encompassing surveillance. Can you explain what is this? What is your take on how AI, this surveillance software, is going to affect people's rights?
Yes, and again, thank you for having me. So here at POGO, our kind of shorthand, we've been tracking the changes in technology for quite some time. And my role as policy counsel here on the Constitution Project is looking at how technology impacts communities across the country, especially when they're used for mass surveillance. And artificial intelligence is one of those technologies, is one of many. Many folks along the border communities know that there's a lot of technology that's been deployed there, from automated license plate readers to AI, of course, cameras, surveillance cameras, drones, things like that. And AI, particularly in the space of facial recognition technology, is one of the areas that we're deeply concerned about.
Why?
So if you think about surveillance and technology changes over the last 25 years, right? At the beginning of the century, you needed dial-up in most instances. Now we're talking about artificial intelligence. We're talking about technologies that can scoop mass amounts of data on people and very quickly and easily identify not just who they are, but their connections, their identities, and their affiliations. And that's a very dangerous thing for the government to have the power to collect. And so with the contract that you're talking about, yes, it is a approximately $9.2 million contract for ICE with Clearview AI, which has had a checkered history in the past with how they've scrubbed images from social media websites to allow ICE to use the technology for facial recognition. And in doing that, that would allow ICE to effectively get a sense, we think, of how people who may have been engaged in assaults interact with them. The problem with that, however, is the broad nature of the contract and the nature of assaults. We know that there have been several instances where ICE has claimed that people have assaulted them in the course of their duties, only to have those charges reduced or dropped because the story didn't hold up. And so the idea of utilizing facial recognition technology to allow people to identify people who may be freely exercising their constitutional right of free speech is problematic.
You mentioned checkered past. Clearview was fined over $50 million by regulators in the UK and Europe for breaching privacy rules there. Do you think the Trump administration is going to come down on them here?
I don't think that's the case, given the fact that they were just awarded a contract. And to be clear, Clearview AI isn't the only company out there that's contracting with the federal government that we have concerns with. As you mentioned at the top, we're a nonpartisan organization. A little bit over a year ago, we wrote to the Biden administration talking about the collection of biometric information, your face, iris scans, things like that, and the concerns that we had over the lack of transparency, accountability, and oversight with the use of those technologies. So this is something that we're, again, deeply concerned with. This administration, in contracting with Clearview AI, shows that we have all the reason, all of us, to be even more concerned with how this technology could be deployed.
You know, here, when we cross to Mexico, come back, we are subject to the facial scan, the biometric images. And so how do you feel about that? I mean, that is, if you come through a U.S. Customs and Border Protection checkpoint, this is something that you have to be amenable for, U.S. citizen or not. How do you feel about that?
I think all of these technologies are problematic. And whether they are used at the border or used in the interior, when you don't have very clear transparency provisions, very clear accountability and oversight that's happening for the technology, you do run the risk of this runaway violation of privacy on a mass scale. So when you think about people crossing the border each and every day, all of those images that are collected, the databases, the massive databases that the federal government has, and thinking now, talking about AI, how artificial intelligence can be used to take disparate pieces of information and effectively develop a dossier on someone. One of the things that we've been tracking in just the last couple of weeks is a letter that was sent from Senator Ed Markey to the acting director of ICE, talking about an app called Mobile Fortify. And this is an app that has been developed recently, and there's not a lot of information on it.
Yeah,
But
it's used to ID undocumented individuals, right?
And one of the concerns that we have is this app being deployed and being used to identify people who are swept up in immigration raids, and the data or the facial scan connecting with different pieces of information from a person's address to vehicle, transportation history. And that's a real concern. Should be a concern for anyone, no matter their political persuasion, because when you are allowing the government to utilize these tools without very clear protections in place for people, it can lead to abuses.
I wanted to ask you, because you mentioned earlier this mass scraping of data from all over. What about the potential sharing of this data among other federal agencies? We know that the IRS has been asked to share information, for instance, with ICE on taxpayers, undocumented taxpayers who have paid into the system for years and years. So could we possibly see the same sharing with some of this data that they're collecting via these AI software devices?
Yes, and I think it's dangerous. I think the biggest pattern that I've seen over the course of this year is the destruction of privacy protections that have existed for decades in both Republican and Democratic administrations that effectively prevent data that you provide to the government from going to sources that really don't make much sense. So think about Medicaid, for instance. If you are a family applying for Medicaid, you imagine that when you submit that application with all of the financial and personal information that you're sending, it will go to an agency and it'll be used to determine whether or not you qualify for Medicaid. No one envisioned that this data from everyone who is an applicant for or recipient of Medicaid would be going to potentially being open to ICE to take a look at. Or the IRS, for instance. Very long-standing privacy protections that have effectively been dismantled to allow for surveillance under the auspices of immigration enforcement.
You know, one of the things that you just mentioned about the data sharing, there's been allegations that the Doge group, the government efficiency group that the Trump administration had actually gathered Social Security data from every American in the system. On a more grander scale, are there any concerns about this, everyone's data being shared, not just those of immigrants that may have been captured in these systems?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, going back to the Medicaid example, there's currently a lawsuit happening between the states and federal government over the sharing of information on, not just the immigrant population, which is problematic to begin with, to be clear, but every individual who is a recipient or an applicant for Medicaid. That's 70 something million people. And you have to ask yourself, why does the government, why does ICE, DHS, need information on healthcare applications effectively from every person who's applied? That just speaks to the mass scale at which surveillance can happen. And again, we should not look at the ubiquitous nature of technology and how quickly it's advancing as a reason to just throw up our hands and say, oh, well, that's just how it's going to be. The Constitution exists to ensure that government doesn't engage in mass surveillance without a warrant of people. And when we allow any administration to effectively start collecting this data, destroying privacy protections, we're all less safe.
All right, we're going to take a quick break, Sandra, and then we're going to continue our conversation with Mr. Don Bell, Policy Counsel for the Constitution Project. Stay with us. Border Report Live is back in 1 minute. Welcome back to Border Report Live. My name is Rudy Mireles. Joining me today, we have our South Texas correspondent, Sandra Sanchez, who's leading a discussion with Mr. Don Bell, Policy Counsel for the Constitution Project.
Boy, the time just went fast. I before we let you go, I just did want to ask you, do you feel like people of color could be unfairly targeted by this type of surveillance?
Absolutely. That's the most concerning thing. I've written over the last year about the changes in surveillance that we've seen and the technological rise of some of these technologies like AI. And we know from history that historically marginalized communities, communities of color, border communities are the ones that are most disproportionately impacted by surveillance. Just a couple of years ago, the city of Detroit had multiple lawsuits against it because of wrongful arrest that were due to bad facial recognition scans. And so we know from our history, surveillance tends to be concentrated on communities of color. And again, that's why you have to have transparency, oversight, and effective accountability to make sure that agencies aren't run amok.
And you mentioned earlier, this technology is new. It's evolving. We don't necessarily have the regulation on it that we might need because it is so new. We're not even sure what we have yet, right?
Yes, that's true. And facial recognition technology, for instance, one of the things that we wrote about to the federal government last year was FRT, facial recognition technology. It's often inaccurate, particularly when it comes to women and people of color. So you may think that you are getting a good scan of a face of a person, identifying them, but you're identifying the wrong person. We know that there are other technologies out there that are being used that are not as accurate, technologies that, again, are disproportionately deployed in communities of color, border communities. And it should not be the case that there are some groups of people in this country who face surveillance and others that do not face the same consequences. There should not be mass surveillance happening in any administration at any time without a warrant.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Bell. We appreciate your time today. Hopefully we can call again on you in the future because this was an incredibly informative conversation, whether you are new to AI or in technology or if you've got some programming skills under the hood and you know what's going on here. It's an incredibly informative conversation. We appreciate your time today, sir.
Of course. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And really quick, before we go, we do want to tell you about a couple different things. The first thing is that if you like what we're doing here at Border Report Live, well, you can now get Border Report Live in audio edition. You can stay informed on stories shaping the U.S.-Mexico border with real-time updates, expert insights, and voices from both sides of the border. You can listen to Border Report Live now on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and the iHeartRadio app, as well as YouTube, as you can see there on the bottom right side of your screen. Also wanted to tell you to check out our partners at Political Power Anchor. It's a weekly show tracking the movers, shakers, and rule makers in American politics. Nexstar's Director of Political Content, Chris Berg, and Director of Emerson College Polling, Spencer Kimball, break down who's up and who's down in the world of politics based on data. And I am so happy to tell you this because I got to take part in Political Power Anchor today. So this newest episode that's going to come out tomorrow is all about the governor's race in California, which you know is a hot one if you follow anything in politics. I got to see some pretty cool data that you don't get to see until tomorrow. But if you want to see that data, make sure to check it out. You can find more on Political Power Anchor at abc27.com or your local Nexstar station's website. That's going to do it for us today. For Sandra, I'm Rudy. Have a great day.